The conversation I've got, probably, I've got 4 little clips. We'll see if we do them all or not, because we've got one other thing to talk about before the end of the show as well. And they were talking about, obviously, Jan Tinetti is the spokesperson for education. And so they started off by talking about the new maths curriculum, which, as you know, we had some guests on last week, a guest on, who was not the biggest fan of what this government is doing. So let's see what Jan Tinetti had to say. Oh, we'll turn that music off now, I guess. Let's see what Jan Tinetti had to say about that.
Well, it depends what they are bringing forward in the new maths curriculum, because we've heard this term structured maths that's been bandied around. There is really no definition of structured maths, and we don't really know what that means. And even the science of learning experts that the Minister has used on her advisory group say there's no evidence around whether a structured maths approach works within the maths curriculum. So we don't know what that looks like. We don't know if it's the same curriculum that we had when we were working out some of those achievement challenges that we had put together with experts, and know whether it'll even work for the New Zealand context. And that's a real concern at this stage.
They both acknowledge at some stage there's a lot of information we don't know. And that's, I think, one of the problems with this government when they're making such changes. They're making such changes, and even if they know in the background what they're going to do, they haven't told us. So the public shouldn't just be going, well, it's not working at the moment, anything would be better, because that's not the truth. Something could be worse. It could be better, but it could be worse. And until we have those details, we're not going to go. That's a recurring theme through this conversation, that we don't know all the details, we don't know all the details, we don't know, which is kind of frightening, seeing they've made the decision, but we don't know all the details. So we'll just keep letting her talking about the new maths curriculum.
Says she wants to act with urgency given the scale of the problem, and she pulled out some stats this week. Said 22% of students had failed to reach the standard that they are.
Jan Tinetti, and Chewy, you say this more than anybody, that when you come on Q&A, you have to be across your numbers and across your research like nothing else. She wasn't really. She wasn't as bad as what we see often on the other side, but she also wasn't across her numbers and her research as well as she should have been. Everybody knows now, you know what Jackie Boy's going to do? He should be across them.
Are expected to achieve. You challenged that number, but I've gone back and looked at the last version of the study in 2022, a study which showed that 42% of students in Year 8 were meeting the expectations of the curriculum. So 42%, 22%, we're kind of quibbling over 2 incredibly poor figures, aren't we?
So absolutely that there is an issue, and I have always been very clear about the fact that there is an issue. When we have our Year 4s under that metric that we were using, 80% of them were at curriculum expectations.
That's Year 4s, but what about Year 8?
Yeah, I'm just getting to that. Yeah. And then 40%, 42...
I have to say as well, I'm sorry to interrupt again, this was handled in a much more back and forth way. Like, he gives her a hard time, but she doesn't react like many of her opposing MPs were, where they were like, they get angry and they get argumentative. She, you know, there's times where she kind of, okay, like takes the hit and then keeps on going. It's a good watch.
45% over the last 13 years have been at curriculum levels.
That's woeful.
There is an
Let's
issue.
be honest, that is woeful.
I wholeheartedly agree.
2 out of 5. The best case scenario, taking your figures instead of the current ministers, 2 out of 5 kids at Year 8 are reaching the curriculum.
I wholeheartedly agree. So can I tell you what we did about that? There's an issue between Year 4 and Year 8. So we had a look at what was happening overseas in the maths area, and some of the countries that this minister has bandied about, like Singapore, for example, they spent years getting their maths curriculum right, and they are world leading in that area, but they spent years getting that right. So we took a similar approach of getting experts in to look at the curriculum, to look at how we can structure and strengthen the steps that happen from Year 4 to Year 8, but also before Year 4 as well. And what happened was that we got this curriculum that was developed by experts, brought the sector on board, and we put that in place last year. Not to implement, but to work with the sector so that they understood it really, really well.
To implement in 2026.
To implement in 2026. But we had to bring the sector with us. Again, going back to some of those places like Singapore, it's exactly the same steps that they took.
Isn't it?
There's the first part. I should have brought it up. I had an answer on one. I put out a clip over the weekend when I think you were talking to Pat Newman about the Singapore example, and someone put in one of my Twitter feeds, because I put the clip out again, that they had maybe one of their children was teaching over in that area, and every student had a tutor who worked with them for an hour a day after school. And it's like when I used to do talkback and people used to talk about the crime stats out of Singapore. And I would say, yeah, but to get that kind of result, you need to have the Singaporean society bought over as well. You can't have, you know, those low crime rates without the incredibly oppressive way they run society. You know, so you can't have those results in our society. You can have those results in their society, but who would want to bring their society here? So it's not apples for apples, Stewie.
Yeah, absolutely. As far as how this, as you said, back and forth between Jack and that, I love the way that she's handling this.
Yeah.
I love that answer of like when he jumps in and goes, and I'd love to tell you about it if you just let me talk. I think it's an amazing way to cover it. I also think she's doing an excellent job of giving context to what Labour had in progress.
Yeah.
Because I think what we're seeing here is that a lot of the groundwork was done, but the implementation is certainly different. And I think it shows a Labour Party taking a whole world view, a kind of holistic view of what is going wrong. It wasn't that they were sitting there going, everything's fine in education, the kids are doing really well. I think there is an acknowledgement of, yes, there is a problem that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and one of the things I really liked about what she said was that we got to start thinking long term. And I know there's criticism over Labour last time they were in for 6 years because they could have tutued with national standards and they didn't really. But then wouldn't that just be doing the same as what these guys have done, is come in and make a big change? What they need to do, and there are countries in the world that do this, is actually get the big parties together and say, we actually need to figure this out. So you're not going to change it when you do get back in. And then when we're in after you again, we're not going to change what you've done. Let's work on it together.
Yeah. Nobody in this room is going to be 100% happy. But we need to get to a point where we're not fucking over these kids every 4 years or every 8 years when somebody else comes in and goes, no, ideologically opposed to all of this. It's all got to go. We're going to move the goalposts on these kids again.
And if they did something,
100% agree.
If they did something and then passed it with like, because you can put things into a different level. I can't think of the word off the top of my head. Do you watch the chat? Correct me. When you're like making decisions based around that you want them to stay longer in Parliament, you need a 75% majority. Like if you're going to lower the age of voting, if they put that kind of legislation on it, then a party like ACT couldn't come in and hold National's head under the water and say, charter schools, because no matter what, if they were a 52% winning party, they still wouldn't be able to change it without a 75% majority. You know what I mean? They could do something like that, even if that's with the core 80% and go, okay, we can tutu with the last 20% ideologically, but that core 80%, I mean, it just seems such a simple idea, incredibly difficult to put into practice. Peter says, Labour puts in the mahi. Nats, she'll be right. Thank you for your super chat. Speaking about the Singaporean one, Dave says Singapore wouldn't even let the Beatles into the length of their hair. The Malululator says Singapore is a very controlled society. And Mike says, no chewing gum in Singapore. And this is the point. When we say we want to be like this country or like that country, or we aspire to be more like that, you can say you aspire to the results of Singapore, but you can't say you want to do what Singapore does, because you need the whole Singaporean lifestyle. You need Singaporean citizens living Singaporean lives and having a Singaporean ethos to get those results. You're not just able to take exactly what they do and place it on top of a laid back, casual Kiwi sort of society.
Yeah. And we do this all the time. We want to cherry pick things out of other countries, but we don't look at what is around it. Like, I would love it if someone came in and said, hey, look, we've looked at education systems around the world. What the one that we want to emulate is Finland. We want their results. And they're not going to look at how much they pay teachers. They're not going to look at things like Finnish kids start school later than us. Like, this is something that I found really interesting, right? School's got to start at 5. Lots of countries don't do that. They start them years later. But yeah, we just cherry pick what we want. And I think for them to go, yep, structured maths works in Singapore, don't need to look into anything else more than the fact that I've name dropped Singapore, which we all know is a very wealthy country, and Australia, because we want to be like Australia. Again, don't look into it.
It is a good point to come in, Chewy, based on your lovely introduction, with the question, what is wrong with structured literacy? Next part of the conversation.
To be taken.
So the government earlier this year announced $67 million for the rollout of structured literacy starting in term 1 of next year. Given you have publicly supported structured literacy, including on this program, what are your concerns about that approach?
So I love structured literacy, just as you've just said. I think it is really important and I like that approach. My concerns are that with bringing in this particular approach, they have demonised reading recovery. Reading recovery has been something that has a lot of research that is around it and sits around it over many years. It has changed in its approach over years.
So it's changed in its approach very recently to become to have a greater structured literacy component,
and that's
right?
what people understand that to happen, but it's changed a long time before that. And as I said to the Minister...
But most recently, right?
No.
You'd agree with that? Most recently,
Yes.
reading recovery has been changed to have a greater emphasis on structured literacy, and surprise, surprise, the results have massively improved.
So why in 1992, when I trained as a reading recovery teacher, did I have structured literacy as part of my training back then, if you're saying that it only just happened recently?
I'm not saying it's only happened recently. I'm saying it's become a greater component of reading recovery recently, and lo and behold, the results have massively improved.
So
is that wrong?
It has changed recently.
It's become
but
a greater component, right?
No, I think you're conflating something there of just saying that it's actually changed just this once to become part of it.
No, I'm saying it's become a greater component.
It's become a big component.
So it's become a greater component since you trained as a reading recovery
teacher. I'd say that it's become a greater component. I'd say that it was already a great component of the program. I think what you're trying to say is that we've had this whole language approach. It hasn't had a whole language approach for years and years and years.
I'm saying that structured literacy is a greater component of reading recovery as a program than it was in 1992 when you trained. And in recent years,
it has grown over years.
And as it's grown,
We're getting a little bit lost in the weeds here, Pat.
Yeah, I think so. But I mean, it's actually stylistically as well. It's still interesting to watch her do this versus, and I won't say the right, but some people who have come on and just got very frustrated and started to argue back. They actually worked it out together in real time on the show.
Improved.
Yeah.
Thus, structured literacy, having it as a greater component, has ended up giving us better results.
So therefore, if that's being the case, that it's grown over time, structured literacy, why are we suddenly getting rid of it and then using that money?
We're replacing it with to support other structured literacy programs.
Are we? Because
according to the government,
we haven't
that's
seen
their pledge.
Yeah, but we haven't seen what those remedial programs will look like yet, and that's a real concern.
Right.
So I was in Christchurch a couple of months ago, where Yolanda Sorrell, who's an amazing structured literacy provider in Christchurch, who has the New Zealand Order of Merit because of her work in structured literacy, is also a reading recovery teacher and teaches 6 months of the year at a school in Christchurch, reading recovery, at a school where they have a structured literacy approach. I went down to watch her teaching. She says the two are completely compatible, and she is incredibly concerned around the loss of reading recovery, the loss of the knowledge of those teachers in this country, the demonisation of reading recovery.
Is there, to your knowledge, is there any reading recovery teacher who won't be invited to retrain with a structured literacy approach to continue to work in learning support?
Well, when I've spoken to them around the country, none of them have actually been invited to retrain.
Right.
Not one of them has been invited
that is the minister's pledge.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we can ask her about
and that concerns me.
Yeah.
When I asked originally, she said that they were the Ministry of Education were contacting those teachers. I have spoken to those teachers. They have said they have not been contacted. Then I put that in a written question to the Minister. She came back and said, it's whether the schools want to have them as a structured literacy, and they will have that opportunity.
There you go. Section 2. Now, Chu, you've always had a bit of a passion about reading recovery. So what are your thoughts around this, sir?
I'm a reading recovery kid. I was a voracious reader once I learned how to read, but it was very clear. And look, I've said this on the show before, I'm an ADD kid as well, who went through a decent amount of childhood trauma when I started school as well. So if it wasn't for a program like Reading Recovery, I don't know when I would have learned to read. So I'm a firm believer in that program being very, very important. I'm consider myself proof of that. So when people start messing with it, I'm just like, oh, are you sure you are dealing with just really the building blocks of learning? Like if you're delayed in learning how to read and stuff like that. And there's lots of reasons why somebody would. Maybe they don't get the best start. This is the whole idea with having a state school curriculum, right? This is everything that National wants to talk about, is that everybody's got to start out on the same starting blocks. Not everybody does. And so a program like Reading Recovery, to get, like, you didn't start it when the starting gun went off, but we've got to get you caught up with these other kids. I think it's something that is enormously important. And I think with all of that backwards and forwards of like, well, reading recovery is old and we're getting rid of it for structured literacy. And well, actually structured literacy is part of the reading recovery, or can be complementary to the reading recovery process, all of that sort of thing. I would much rather hear from teachers than Erica Stanford, as an example.
That seems to be the MO of this government so far, is that they're basically saying we're going to tell the experts what to do. And that was what we got so much from Pat Newman last week, him saying this guy is not an educator, yet he's making these big sweeping changes in education, just like they did in 2011 under John Key. We told them it wasn't going to work, it didn't work, and they're doing it all over again. And it seems like that's quite a common occurrence. I mean, not to I was going to say something like to sink the ferry now, but Nicola Willis making a decision based on what's best for the country around ferries, and it's proven to be possibly the worst decision any government's made any time recently. Is going to cost us more and we're going to get less for it. It's not her skill set, but because the ledger didn't work for her, she made the decision. They're making decisions that experts should be advising them on and they should be making via them themselves, probably because that thing we always say, they're always trying to attain the one thing they haven't got yet. Before the election, it was getting elected, and now it's getting tax cuts. And probably for Mr. Luxon, it's getting a knighthood. They're trying to achieve the next thing, and that's what their focus is.
What's the problem they're trying to solve?
Yeah, and that means that they're making decisions based on getting that done rather than decisions based on maybe what's best in that situation.
And I think, look, they talk about the curriculum. They talk about structured literacy and they sort of point at something like reading recovery like it's old and it's not working. But they have not at any stage talked about the one thing that is almost universally agreed on as a big problem for the starting school and early learning and all of that sort of stuff, which is classroom size.
Yeah. How
many teachers per pupil, how many pupils per teacher do you have? In the aspect of like, oh yeah, well, we can have one teacher for 25 to 30 students, and maybe a teacher's assistant shared between 3 or 4 classrooms is clearly not up to snuff.
Yeah.
And that has never been mentioned with all of this fiddling around curriculum. And what are we going to get the teachers that we do have to do? There's been no talk of getting more teachers outside of the discussion about charter schools, where the answer is apparently they don't even need to be teachers.
Yeah, again, Chewy, look at you, sir. You just do the work for me. We're going to move into two quick commentaries around charter schools. This was the part of the conversation that she wasn't really across her numbers. And one of the problems is Willie Jackson has already said publicly to Jack Tame that charter schools worked. He has to support them because they worked for him. So now to have this opposition saying charter schools aren't going to work, Willie Jackson's comments are a thorn on their side, and they're not entirely sure how to handle that quite yet. I'm going to play 2 back-to-back here because the first one's only 30 seconds, and it's just Jan basically confirming what they're going to do to charter schools when they get back in.
I want to reiterate first, before I say my response to that, is that Labor has got rid of these before and we will get rid of them again because they are bad for young people and bad for their learning.
Will you, just on that point, even if contracts are in place, will you break those contracts? They're 10-year-long contracts.
We will be looking at legal advice around that, but we will get rid of charter schools. We will not have charter schools.
If your legal advice says you can break those 10-year contracts, will you do so?
If that legal advice comes back to say
Willie
that.
Jackson.
So then they go on to talk about Willie Jackson in that conversation as well. I'm going to just find it here rather than try and load up one that I've already loaded up. to make sure it all works lovely. So then they went into conversations around charter schools, the difference with charter schools compared, like the difference this time around compared to what that we had with charter schools last time around. And again, you know, she uses the phrase in this dodgy, you know, this legislation is dodgy. That's not good communicating. That's what, if someone else said that, I'd be like, well, what do you mean? What do you mean dodgy? What does one mean by that? So that's just part of the conversation.
Yeah. The key difference is that we have this charter school agency, and to quote David Seymour, the Associate Minister, charter schools will largely be funded on a per student basis. Funding will be broadly equivalent to that of state schools with similar roles and characteristics. But there are accountability measures under the charter school agency.
Well, she didn't call it out.
Reporting, auditing and sanctions that are more stringent than the previous partnership schools model. That's a big difference.
I've been sitting on select committee. This is a dodgy piece of legislation. This is not one that I would recommend for anybody to actually undertake. It's been rushed through. I also
and so I would go, why? Why is it dodgy? She has there's a very good story here about an Australian group who are obviously just after the dollar, but she's just not quite. No credit. I'm a little bit of credit. She's not quite across the numbers as much as she should be. And I think Willie Jackson's comments have thrown a bit of a what do you say? Something into the engine? Whatever. Cause some problems for them to have to actually deal with.
I'm really concerned about some of the hearings that we've heard just this week. And these are public hearings, so I'm not saying anything that's happened outside of the public hearings. But just this week, there was an Australian charter school conglomerate who did their presentation, who are actively seeking to come here to work with New Zealand kids. They have charter schools with 1,500 kids in Australia. They are with disengaged kids. When I asked about their work with Māori and how they could work with Māori, who predominantly make up those statistics, they had no idea. And they gave an answer. And look, all credit to them. They are there purely for money. Well, this is about
lucky we've got this accountability measure, right? So there's going to be reporting, auditing and sanctions. The charter school agency can remove the charter schools, can remove it from operating if it doesn't meet the required standards.
We're still putting schools that will put profit ahead of kids. We're also, they don't have to teach the New Zealand curriculum. But if the kids get better outcomes, surely that's a net positive. They don't have to teach the New Zealand curriculum. They don't have to have registered teaching.
I'm not sure, with respect, that the New Zealand curriculum has necessarily been working for our students. If you go and look at those achievement standards over the last 2 decades.
There you go. That's the end of the conversation that we're going to play with.
I got to admit, when I watched it on Sunday, that is a hard statement to counter. Right?
Which one's specifically?
Like, as much as you know, the argument against charter schools being, well, they don't have to teach the New Zealand curriculum, and the comment after that was like, well, I don't think we can defend our curriculum if those are the results that we're getting from it.
Yeah, that's
a pretty devastating sort of thing. And I think, as much as I'm against charter schools, and I am, because I think that is privatization. The answers need to get better than they'll try and make a profit.
Yeah,
because that's a very easy thing to counter, is like, well, sometimes profit's not bad, right? They have to get better at answering that question.
Yeah,
like,
and
I think the real answer here is, are charter schools going to get more money per student than a state school would be? Because then it's not a fair comparison.
When we know that they're being given more per student for the state school, we understand, but maybe the way they work it out is, like the school that's down the road that's already got buildings and all those kinds of things, they don't give them money for the buildings. Maybe charter school, they include that in the per child amount or something. I'm not sure. But what I was going to say is, and we say this all the time when we hear Luxo Flakes being talked about like he's running the country like a business, that this is not a business, and business's primary and sole objective is to return its investor a profit. That's it. And actually they are legally required to try and do that, to return their investor, their shareholders, their owner a profit, right? You can't especially if you've got shareholders, you can't not do everything you can to return a profit. And as soon as you put that into a service, because education is a service, right? That's when you get the worries and the concerns. I mean, the proof will be in the pudding. Notice they only ever talk about one charter school, and that's that military one. There's no other ones they talk about.
Yeah,
but like I said, Willie hasn't helped the situation by basically having to admit, and we played this back a few weeks ago, that he supported charter schools for Māori, and he would be a hypocrite not to kind of say it again this time around. And now you've got the left also saying no to charter schools. So, yeah, I'm not saying I don't want to have a political party just do messaging based on ideologies. I want them to talk and speak the truth, but that's an issue for them. It's an issue for them that they're actively going, this education is not serving Māori well, so that means a charter school might actually serve them better. No, we have to change the whole system to service them well. You know, there's an issue there that they need to figure out.
Yeah. I mean, I must admit, when you talked about charter schools to start with, that was one of the first things that I thought of, was that we're always talking about how the current system doesn't serve Māori well, and maybe they should set up their own system. And charter schools seem to be the answer to that.
At the current answer, yeah.
Yeah, and it's, you know, when you dig a little bit further than that, it's just like, well, no, we don't want Māori to go off and do their own thing in education necessarily. We want our whole education system to become more, with more Māori involved. You know, I think there was another, I don't think we played a clip of it about it, but was talking about teachers' competency and confidence in teaching math was really interesting in there as well. Just from a professional development, there was a stat mentioned about how many teachers feel confident in teaching math, and it was a scarily low number. So, I mean, is it the kids that are doing it wrong, or are the teachers going through teachers' college not getting it right? Do we have the right people? Yeah, it's such a big thing.
Yeah,
and I think the government that we have just wants to go, well, our big solution to this is structured whatever and charter schools, big rubber stamp, job done. And I don't have the confidence that they have taken the best advice to get to that position.
Yeah,
I think they have lobbyists in their party that believe that they're the people that are telling them what to do. I think it's a good idea, and there's definitely profit to be extracted. And I think it is coming into that whole thing of like privatizing a core part of the functions of the state here in New Zealand.
Yeah,
that's what's giving me the ick about this whole thing.